You are standing in a circle. Not a metaphorical circle, a real one. Dirt under your feet, fire in the middle, 23 people around you, every single one of them staring directly at you. No lawyer, no jury selection, no paperwork, no guy in a robe reading from a leather book. Just you, the group, and the very uncomfortable silence of 30 collective eyes deciding what happens next. That was the justice system 100,000 years ago. And it was, depending on which side of the circle you were standing on, either remarkably fair or absolutely terrifying. And before you assume you would have been fine, before you assume you would have been one of the ones watching rather than the one being watched, consider this. The rules that got people dragged into that circle weren't exotic. They weren't unusual. They were things people do every single day in modern life without a second thought, taking a little more than your share, undermining someone behind their back, letting your ego get slightly too large for the space you were living in. In a world without laws, those weren't personality quirks. They were existential threats. And the group had a response, a very specific, very graduated, very psychologically sophisticated response.
And some of it worked better than anything we've built since. Here's the thing nobody really asks. What actually happened when someone broke the rules before rules were written down, before courts existed, before police existed, before the prisons existed, before the concept of a law had been invented by anyone, anywhere on the planet? Because here's what most people assume. Ancient humans were basically just violent, that it was chaos, that whoever was biggest and strongest did whatever they wanted, and everyone else just suffered through it. And that assumption is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally, embarrassingly, completely wrong. Because the truth of how ancient humans handled rule breaking is one of the most sophisticated, psychologically nuanced systems ever developed by our species, and nobody taught it to anyone. It just evolved, naturally, out of pure survival necessity. And some of it, the parts we quietly abandoned somewhere between the invention of the courtroom and the invention of the prison cell, worked better than what we replaced it with.
This video is going to cover the full picture, the rules themselves and why they existed, the escalation system ancient humans used to enforce them, what happened to chronic offenders, what happened to violent ones, how ancient children were taught right from wrong without schools or books or any of the infrastructure we associate with moral education, how different ancient cultures around the world developed strikingly similar systems independently, and what we lost when we scaled up. Because the answer to what happened when you broke the rules 100,000 years ago isn't just history, it's a mirror, and the reflection is uncomfortable. Because before you can break a rule, the rule has to exist. And here's the part that surprises most people. Hunter-gatherer societies, the kind our ancestors lived in for the overwhelming majority of human history, did have rules. Rigid ones. They just didn't look like anything you'd recognize. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Batek of Malaysia, the Martu of Australia, the Aceh of Paraguay, have found the same core set of prohibitions appearing across cultures that never had contact with each other. No hoarding resources, no taking more than your share of a kill, no undermining the group's ability to make collective decisions, no unprovoked violence against members of your own group, no sleeping with another person's partner without consent, no claiming status you hadn't earned, no refusing to contribute to shared labor without cause. These weren't written anywhere. They didn't need to be. They were enforced by something far more powerful than legislation. They were enforced by the fact that breaking them could get everyone killed. A group of 25 people living on the edge of survival doesn't have room for a free rider, doesn't have room for someone who takes without giving, doesn't have room for someone whose ego disrupts the coordination that keeps the group alive. The rules weren't moral abstractions invented by philosophers sitting in comfortable rooms. They were load-bearing walls. Remove one, and the whole structure becomes dangerous. The group understood this not as a theory, but as a lived, daily, physical reality. You followed the rules because the alternative wasn't just social disapproval. The alternative was everyone dying, including you. Keep that in mind as we go through the ladder, because each rung makes more sense when you understand what it was actually protecting. Step 1 was almost never punishment. Step 1 was something much more uncomfortable. It was public conversation. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying what he called reverse dominance hierarchies in hunter-gatherer societies. What he found was that these groups had an extraordinarily well-developed system for managing individual behavior through collective social pressure. When someone stepped out of line, the group talked about it loudly. publicly, often within earshot of the person being discussed. Gossip in early human society wasn't petty or trivial. It was the enforcement mechanism, the alarm system, the trial, and the sentencing all rolled into one. And it worked because reputation was everything, not in the modern social media sense, where reputation is abstract and distant, and you can always make a new account. In a group of 25 people who sleep 3 feet away from each other, who share every meal, who depend on each other for literal survival, your reputation is the difference between thriving and being abandoned. One bad story spreading through the group could cost you more than any fine, more than any prison sentence. It could cost you your place, your access to food, to warmth, to protection, to the basic cooperative infrastructure that kept you alive. The stakes of reputation in a small ancient group were not metaphorical, they were biological. Researchers have estimated that in most documented hunter-gatherer societies, somewhere between 60 and 70% of all social talk is gossip. Information sharing about who did what, who could be trusted, who is pulling their weight, who isn't. This isn't a flaw in human social behavior, it's a feature. It's a distributed surveillance system that requires no central authority, no enforcement body, no infrastructure at all. It runs entirely on human social attention, and it is, by available evidence, remarkably effective. Most rule-breaking in small groups gets corrected at this stage, before any confrontation, before any formal response, just by the person feeling the temperature in the room drop around them and making a quiet decision to correct course. But not everyone corrected course, and for those people, the group had a sequence, a graduated ladder of responses that escalated in intensity while always trying to preserve the group's most valuable resource, its members. The second rung was the cold shoulder, deliberate, coordinated, unmistakable social withdrawal, slightly smaller portions of the communal meal, conversations that ended when you approached, eyes that looked away just a beat too quickly. In modern life, this sounds like a minor social inconvenience. In a group of 25 people with no outside world to retreat to, coordinated social withdrawal is suffocating. There is nowhere to go, no other social circle to join, no coffee shop to sit in alone with your headphones in, just the group and the group's coordinated silence and the slowly building understanding that something has to change. The third rung was direct public confrontation. Not private, not gentle, not a quiet word pulled aside. Public. The offender would be called out in front of everyone, named, made to account for their behavior in the open, with no audience neutral enough to let it slide unacknowledged. Shame in a small group is not what shame feels like in modern life. In modern life, shame is uncomfortable. In a group of 25 people on the Pleistocene savanna, shame is a full-body experience with no exit route and life or death stakes attached to its resolution. The confrontation wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake, it was calibrated. A reminder that the group saw everything, remembered everything, and was watching what you did next. The fourth rung is the one that most surprises people when they encounter it in the anthropological record. Ridicule and humiliation, weaponized, collective, surgically precise mockery. The person who had overstepped would become the subject of jokes, imitation, exaggerated storytelling, their transgression retold and amplified until the humiliation created the correction. Anthropologist Richard Lee documented this exact mechanism among the Kung San, a hunter who returned from a successful kill and began displaying pride about it. The group would mock him aggressively and relentlessly. They would call the animal small. They would joke that it was barely worth eating. They would imitate the hunter's pride in exaggerated form until he himself began to downplay his success, to laugh along, to shrink back into the collective. This practice was so consistent and so deliberate that the Kung San had a name for it. They called it insulting the meat. And when Lee asked hunters directly about it, they explained it themselves. When a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man. We must cool his heart and make him gentle. The mockery wasn't cruelty, it was thermostat maintenance. It put the individual back inside the collective before the individual's ego became a structural problem. This is where it gets dark, because ancient human justice did have a final answer for people who ignored every rung of the ladder, and it was not prison, it was not a fine, it was not community service, it was ostracism, banishment, exile, For a solo human on the Pleistocene, being removed from the group was not a symbolic punishment, it was a death sentence with a variable timeline. No group meant no shared hunting. No group meant no shared fire in the cold. No shared defense against predators. No one to watch your back while you slept. No one to care for you if you got injured, if you got sick, if you broke a bone or caught an infection. A single human alone in that environment had a life expectancy measurable in weeks, sometimes days. Banishment was the ancient equivalent of the harshest sentence a modern court could hand down, and it was reserved carefully and deliberately for people who had failed every other rung of the ladder. But here is the detail that modern legal systems have no clean equivalent for. Ostracism wasn't necessarily permanent. In many documented hunter-gatherer societies, a banished individual could appeal to return if they demonstrated, over time and from a distance, that they had genuinely changed, that the behavior that got them expelled had stopped, that they had something to offer the group again. They could petition for readmission. The group would deliberate, consensus would be reached, and if enough members agreed, the person came back. Rehabilitation wasn't a concept invented by progressive legal theorists in the 20th century. It was built into the oldest justice system on Earth, out of pure pragmatism. Skilled people were a resource. Losing one permanently was expensive. Getting a corrected, humbled, contributing person back was a net gain. The ancient calculus of justice wasn't moral idealism. It was resource management, and it arrived at some of the same conclusions that modern restorative justice advocates are still fighting to implement today. One of the most underexplored questions in this space is how ancient children absorbed the rule system, because there were no classrooms, no books, no structured moral education, no after-school program teaching ethics. So how did it work? The answer, according to researchers studying child development in hunter-gatherer societies, is that moral education happened continuously, environmentally, and through a mechanism that modern children have almost entirely lost access to: play. Hunter-gatherer children spent the overwhelming majority of their non-sleeping hours in mixed-age playgroups, children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, largely unsupervised by adults, navigating their own social world. And that social world had exactly the same enforcement mechanisms as the adult world: gossip, social exclusion, public confrontation, mockery. Children who were selfish, who hoarded, who dominated unfairly, experienced the full weight of the group's response at child scale. Over years of this, they didn't learn the rules intellectually, they learned them in their bodies, in their nervous systems. The rules became instinct rather than knowledge. Developmental psychologist Peter Gray, who spent years studying this in detail, argues that this form of self-directed social play is one of the most important and most neglected developmental experiences in modern childhood. Modern children, he argues, spend dramatically less time in unsupervised, mixed-age playgroups than any children in human history. They spend far more time in adult-supervised, adult-structured environments where the natural social enforcement mechanisms don't operate. Adults intervene before the cold shoulder lands. Adults resolve conflicts before the public confrontation can do its work. Adults protect children from the very experiences that for 300,000 years built the social instincts that made human cooperation possible. He doesn't say this to be provocative. The developmental data says it for him.
Everything described so far, the gossip, the cold shoulder, the confrontation, the ridicule, the banishment, all of it operated on the assumption that the person who broke the rules was reachable, correctable, worth investing in. There was one category of offense where that assumption was suspended entirely, and that was chronic, repeated, unprovoked violence within the group. Bohm documented cases across dozens of unrelated ethnographic records where groups reached consensus to kill a member who had become what he describes as a chronic bully or a serial killer within the group. The pattern was consistent across cultures. First, the full ladder was attempted: the gossip, the exclusion, the confrontation, the banishment. And when the person returned and the behavior resumed, or when the violence was so severe that the ladder felt inadequate to the threat, the group moved to a final solution: collective execution. What is striking about these cases is not the violence of the outcome, it is the process that preceded it. deliberation, consensus building, discussion across the entire group, including the offender's own family members, who participated in the decision because they understood that the threat the person represented was a threat to everyone, including the people who loved them. These were not impulsive mob responses. They were not driven by one dominant individual's personal vendetta. They were, by every available measure in the ethnographic record, carefully considered collective decisions made under conditions of genuine moral weight. The execution of a chronic violent threat in a hunter-gatherer society looks, structurally, almost nothing like what most people imagine when they hear the word mob justice. It looks far more like what we would recognize, imperfectly and with discomfort, as a jury verdict, reached slowly, reached collectively, reached with an understanding of what was being decided and why. Here is something the tidy version of this story leaves out. Not every ancient group ran the same system, and the variations between groups reveal something important about human nature. Some groups were more egalitarian in their enforcement, decisions made by consensus, power distributed flatly, no individual or subgroup with the authority to unilaterally punish. These groups tended to be smaller, more mobile, with less accumulated property and less resource competition. The Batek of Malaysia are a documented example, a group so committed to non-hierarchical conflict resolution that they developed a specific cultural practice of simply leaving. When conflict arose that couldn't be resolved through the normal social mechanisms, the aggrieved party, or sometimes the whole group, would relocate. Mobility as justice, distance as justice. Other groups, particularly those in environments with more concentrated resources, a particularly rich fishing site, a predictable seasonal migration route, developed more hierarchical enforcement structures, a council of elders, a recognized arbitrator, an individual whose social role included formal dispute resolution. These proto-legal roles appear in the archaeological and anthropological record much earlier than most people expect, not as kings or rulers with coercive power, but as respected mediators whose authority derived entirely from the group's trust in their judgment. The moment that trust eroded, the authority evaporated. There was nothing structural holding it in place except the collective willingness to defer. This variation matters because it shows something. Ancient justice wasn't a single system. It was a family of solutions to the same problem, calibrated to local conditions, local resource environments, local group dynamics. The underlying logic was consistent: maintain group function, correct behavior when possible, remove threats when necessary, but the implementation was flexible, adaptable, almost experimentally iterative, which is, if you think about it, exactly what you'd expect from a species building its first social technologies in real time. Modern justice systems solve real problems that ancient systems couldn't. The math of gossip and reputation doesn't work across a city of 8 million people. You cannot run a circle-based consensus trial for a society with complex property law and anonymous strangers interacting at scale. Centralized legal infrastructure exists for reasons. This is not a utopian argument for abolishing courts, but in solving the scale problem, something specific was traded away. Ancient justice was personal. The victim was present. The offender faced the people they had harmed directly, not a representative of the state. The community was present. The outcome had to make sense to everyone in the circle, not just to a judge applying a written standard to an abstracted set of facts. There was no paperwork separating the harm from the response, no procedural buffer between the person who was hurt and the decision about what happened next. The justice was immediate, visible, and human in a way that modern systems, by design, are not. Restorative justice, one of the fastest-growing movements in modern criminal law reform, is a rediscovery of this. The idea that justice should involve the offender confronting the actual reality of what they did in front of the people they harmed in a structured setting aimed at repair rather than pure punishment. Countries that have implemented it seriously, New Zealand, Norway, parts of Canada, report lower recidivism, higher victim satisfaction, and comparable community safety outcomes to purely punitive approaches. It is presented in legal reform circles as a radical new idea. It is approximately 100,000 years old. The circle had a logic to it, a hard, survival-tested, deeply human logic. It kept groups together. It corrected behavior without destroying the person when possible. It escalated proportionally. It protected the collective without losing sight of the individual inside it. It taught children through immersion rather than instruction. It handled violence without celebrating it. And it did all of this without a single written word, a single law school, a single courtroom, and no correctional facilities. We didn't build justice systems because we learned how to be fair. We built them because we got too big to sit in the circle.
And somewhere in that scaling process, in all the necessary complexity we added, we lost some things that were never formally documented, never officially retired, never consciously abandoned. They just quietly disappeared behind the paperwork, and we've been trying, in courtrooms and reform movements and restorative circles and community mediation programs, to quietly find our way back to them ever since. The circle, it turns out, knew something.